morning, everyone. Well, why don't we get started with Bibles and such. If you have one, great. If you don't and you feel like reading along, you put your hand up, and we have ushers that hand out Bibles, so that'll happen. I would like to also make mention of the fact that it's Mother's Day. My mother is in Alaska, so it's difficult for me to wish my mother a happy Mother's Day in person. But I'd like to wish all the mothers here a very wonderful and happy Mother's Day, and admonish every single child to give their mother a hug. So do that. Good. Like Sean said, I would like to preach on following Jesus. That's a good slide. I like that picture. Okay, so following Jesus. I like what Ben gives me a call. Ben Hoppy, he was our worship leader. He gives me a call and he says, "Peter, what are you preaching on?" I said, "Yeah, I'm going to be on following Jesus." And Ben says, "Oh, okay, good. I want to preach some songs that have to do with following Jesus." So of course, as I'm singing, I'm thinking to myself, which song is Ben singing that's going to do following Jesus? And I didn't talk to him about this, but I'm guessing at least one of them was Step by Step. Step by step you'll lead me, and I will follow you in all of my ways. And I like that. So good job, Ben. Thank you. And as I was singing that, I said, yeah, I hope this is preparing us for the sermon. So when you were singing that, we were subliminally preparing you for this message. So now you are prepared. All right, good, perfect. So let's open up to John chapter 10, verse 1 through 20. We could. And as we're reading it, keep in mind the fact that we're going to be talking about following Jesus. Chance to get there. So here we go. Verse 1. I tell you the truth. The man who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. The man who enters by the gate is a shepherd of his sheep. The watchman opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls out his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. Remember that, because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. Jesus used this figure of speech, but they did not understand what he was telling them. Therefore, Jesus said, I tell you the truth. I am the gate for the sheep. All who ever came before me were thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. He will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd who owns the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. Remember that. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life, only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down, and authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. So there's these sheep, and then there's this shepherd, and then there's these strangers, and the disciples are hearing Jesus, and maybe there are others there, and they're listening to Jesus explain this, and they don't get it. This is very common in the New Testament, where Jesus will tell this parable or a story, and they're left scratching their heads. Jesus, we don't get it. And sometimes Jesus blesses us with an explanation of what it means. Sometimes he doesn't. This time he breaks it down for them, and he says, look, I'm the shepherd. And he says that multiple times. He says, I am the good shepherd in verse 11. In verse 14, he says, I am the good shepherd. And it's clear, he's the shepherd. We are the sheep. So, in this picture, the shepherd-looking person is Jesus. The sheep-looking people are us. Good. All right. Now, the sheep are supposed to follow the shepherd. And it says that they follow the shepherd because they know his voice. And they know him. And this is what we're going to be talking about. How do we know, how are we able to distinguish the call of the Lord versus the call of a stranger? We need that discernment in our life. Yeah, thank you, Jackie. I was hoping I'd get some of that. You know, my father is in Alaska right now, my Pastor Paul, and so that's why we have me today. And I'm not as good as my dad at this, but I'm really excited to get to preach. It wouldn't be the same if I didn't get Jackie's input, so that's good. All right. So let's see. Will you follow Jesus? I want to think about first how, Jesus goes up to his disciples and he says, "Follow me." So let's read this. He says, "As Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon called Peter and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. 'Come, follow me,' Jesus said, 'and I will send you out to fish for men.' At once they left their nets and followed him. Going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. They were in a boat with their father Zebedee, preparing their nets. Jesus called them, and immediately they left their boat and their father and followed him." Jesus comes up to these fishermen and says, "Follow me." And I think that when they leave their nets and they leave their boat and they leave their father, that shows that they were willing to leave their career behind, their family behind, for the sake of following Jesus. This is more than one afternoon they were at their boat and then they left it for the day. I think that what's being described here is that they gave up a way of life in order to follow Jesus. So that's why I have under here, they left their nets, they left their father, they left their boat. Are we willing to do that? Are we willing to leave everything for the sake of following Jesus? So, this is a picture of Jesus coming to them, saying, "Follow me." I think that, and I was talking with some friends about this, did they even know who Jesus was? Was this just some guy that, "Hey, follow me"? I said, no, I really think they did know who Jesus was. But we can get, that's another discussion. But I knew that this is supernatural, I think. They probably didn't know Jesus very well, but they knew that, okay, Jesus is the man, let's follow this guy. So here's the sermon outline. No sermon is complete without an outline. So if you're one of those note takers, this is the moment. So we've got, can you hear the shepherd's voice? We talked about that. You need to hear the voice of the Lord to be able to correctly follow him. That's what we saw in John chapter 10. Do you know Christ? Right? It says, "I know the sheep and the sheep know me." Will you follow Christ? Are you going to follow him? What does it cost to follow in Christ? And lastly, what does it look like to follow? Okay, so whose voice are you listening to? Later in the same chapter, it says, "You do not believe because you are not my sheep. My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me." My sheep know my voice. Are we able to discern the voice of the Lord? I think of the song, "Softly and tenderly Jesus is calling." He's calling for you and for me. Are we able to follow him by hearing his voice? He's calling for us. Jesus calls out to each and every one of us. I believe that. It's just that some of us drown it out and we don't hear him. So, what does the voice of the Lord sound like? I was thinking of this verse in Isaiah. "Whether you turn to the right or to the left, your ears will hear a voice behind you saying, 'This is the way, walk in it.'" This is the way, walk in it. Like I said, some people drown it out. Jesus calls out to every one of us. But we drown it out. How do we do that? I think that the voice of the Lord is convicting. It says, "This is the way. You're walking down this road of sin and selfishness and worldliness. I have a different path for you. Follow this." And it convicts our heart. And it's very hurtful at first to be able to acknowledge that we are not able to make it out on our own. And so we drown it out. So what does that look like? In Isaiah chapter 30, "For these are rebellious people, deceitful children, children unwilling to listen to the Lord's instruction. They say to the seers, 'See no more visions,' and to the prophets, 'Give us no more visions of what is right. Tell us pleasant things, prophesy illusions.' leave this way, get off this path, and stop confronting us with the Holy One of Israel. They're adamant about this. Don't tell me the truth. Tell me lies. I want to hear good things about myself. It reminds me of these two kings. They're like, yeah, let's go to war. And then they ask the prophet, go to war, it's good, you'll win. And they're like, no, where's the voice of the Lord? And then another prophet, who's the real prophet, said, yeah, you're gonna lose. And they didn't like it. And I always wondered, why is it that they wanted to find a prophet of the Lord if they didn't listen to him? But I don't understand that. It was because people don't want to hear from God. They'd like to drown it out. Here's a New Testament verse that's similar in 2 Timothy. For the time will come when men will not put up with sound doctrine. Instead, to suit their own desires, they will gather around them a great number of teachers to say what their itching ears want to hear. So, they don't want to hear the truth. They want to be told, what I'm doing, my life of sin, is okay. And so that voice of the shepherd saying, hey, sheep, follow me. Come this way. They don't want to hear it. They say, no, I don't hear that. And so let me just give you a preview of the stranger guy that chapter 10 talks about. If we're drowning out the voice of the shepherd, and we do not want to listen to the convicting voice of the Holy Spirit, then we are that much more vulnerable to responding to some other voice. There's a way that seems right to a man, and in the end that leads to death. And if we strike out on our own and we say, well, I don't need a shepherd, I don't need to hear the voice of God, I can make it on my own, that will not do us well in the end. So, the following after the world is a chasing after the wind. And when we go our own way, we're led by something other than ourselves. We're led by the stranger, we're led by the world, we're led by those around us. And the way we live our life, if it's not in accordance with what Jesus would have us to do, then in fact what we are doing is we are following after the world and is a chasing after the wind. And it's a life of ultimate meaninglessness. And that's something that each and every one of us longs for as a purpose in life. And if we seek to find purpose in ourselves, we will always be left wanting. I was thinking of an 80s song that I was listening to. Listen to Your Heart is the name of the song by Roxette. So if you're not familiar with it, that's fine. But the message of it and countless other songs of the 80s and today is that we should listen to our heart. Yeah, that's where the truth comes from. If you have a decision to make, then by all means, search your heart. Find the truth within. It's the most deceitful lie ever, right? We know that the heart is deceitful and wicked above all, right? So if we're going to look for a direction in life based on what our heart is telling us in the moment, we will be left like a sheep that's like stumbling around and going in circles and falling over itself, and it will not get to any green pasture, I can assure you of that. So, do not believe the lie that you will find direction from your heart. And I was showing a good friend of mine, Mr. Dane, my slides, and when he saw this, he started laughing because he used to tell me that this was one of his favorite songs. But then he said, no, don't follow your heart. Your heart is deceitful. And he was basically preaching my sermon to me while I was showing him the slides. He's like, no, don't follow your heart. Lead your heart. And so I put that in quotations. Oh, that's good. Lead your heart. So you have this heart, and it needs to be either led or followed by, right? So if you are following your heart's desire, then you are just, going off into who knows where. But if you have a discernment of what Christ is telling you, and you say, go this way, I believe that it's very important to bring your heart along for the ride. And it will eventually get there, and it will be a good thing. Okay, good. So, that's the voice of God. This is the voice of a stranger. Good. I'm glad. I was thinking, what does a stranger look like? What could be a good interpretation of the stranger? The stranger's goal is to steal and to kill and to destroy. Yes. And it might even be alluring at first. So when someone says, has your mom ever told you, do not talk to strangers, right? Do not go with strangers, even if they tell you that they have free candy, right? And yet, that's what Satan does. That's what the stranger does. That's what deceitful people do when they come along and say, I've got something for you. You need to follow me. I've got a plan for what you should do with your life, and it's going to seem good. It's going to be alluring, and it's going to be the exact opposite of what God has for you. And if you're not able to discern the voice of God versus the voice of a stranger, you will be duped every time, and you will end up being taken for a ride by someone you would not otherwise want to be taken with a ride by. So that is the voice of a stranger, and I hope that this stays with you all, because, to be honest, strangers in rusty, beat-up cars, you know, you can pretty much, from a glance, say, yeah, that's not the real thing. But Satan has been around a very long time, and he knows how to make it look good, and he knows how to make it appear like he is not the evil person that he really is. And so this is why Jesus says, there have been people that have come before me and will come after me that will tell you lies, and they may seem believable, but it's only for the purpose of destruction. So do you know Christ? It says in verse 14, I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. So we need to be discerning. We need to know what is the shepherd and what is the stranger. And we need to be able to know the shepherd so well that when he goes somewhere, we can follow him. I was thinking of the verse in Philippians. It says, I want to know Christ, yes, to know the power of his resurrection and participation in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, and so somehow attaining to the resurrection from the dead. I want to know Christ. That word know is not the kind of know that is like, I know about Columbus and how he discovered America and, sailed the ocean blue in 1492. That's not the kind of knowing we're talking about. We're talking about the kind of knowing that says, I've spent time with this person, and I know what this person likes and what it doesn't like, and all these things. It has to do with an intimate knowing of someone. So I want to know Christ. It's a participation in what that person is doing. What did Jesus do? Jesus suffered. He was a man of sorrows. He did things in life that were unpleasant. And when he says, hey, follow me in this, he's saying, I want you to know me the way that you would know someone who follows you. I think of an Indian who says, like walk in my shoes, or like muklaks, or whatever it is, or, don't judge a man until you walked in his snowshoes for 3 days, or something like that. Like, join me in my travels, and if you can come with me through hardship and sorrow and persecution, then you know me. And this is what Paul is saying. I want to know Christ like that. I want to be able to participate in those same sufferings for the purpose of being able to know God and being able to follow him. So, Rachel, Prevette, and I are courting. We're getting to know each other better. And in order to do that, we spend time together. And in that process, I've learned some things about her. She likes chocolate better than vanilla. Her favorite color is purple. Things like that. In the same way, we learn things about God when we spend time with him and when we get to know him better. And so we can learn things from God that are preferences, where he says things like, to obey me is better than sacrifice. Right? These are preferences that God has. It's important for us to know God so that when someone comes to me and says, I think God's telling me that I should, disobey my parents, or, I think God's telling me I should divorce this person and do this instead. And I say, you don't know the will of God. You do not know God's preferences. That is not what God desires. That is not who God is. You don't know God. You have not spent time with God, or you would know that that is not the voice of God telling you to do that. Yeah, when you're trying to follow God and you do not know what Jesus or God does or doesn't like, then you are in trouble, because you will not know this voice that's telling you something is not from him. So will you follow Christ? Would the church even recognize God? That's another question I was going to ask. I'll just let that one sit there for a minute. If Jesus came back, would we recognize him? I hope we would, because he's going to come back in the clouds and really awesome stuff like that. But if Jesus came, would we recognize him? When he went to Nazareth, they didn't know who he was. They didn't recognize that he was speaking the truth. I would hope that if you got a message from Jesus, that you would be able to recognize it. Okay, so will you follow Christ? It says that his sheep follow him. If we are truly the sheep of Jesus, then we are following him. So in Ephesians 5, it says, "Therefore be imitators of Christ as beloved children, and walk in love, just as Christ also loved you and gave himself up for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God as a fragrant aroma." So walk in love. I like this idea of there's this path of love that we're following Jesus down. The shepherd is taking us down we're walking in love, and we're imitating God. And so this is the idea of following him, is Jesus set an example for us. And so in order for us to participate in the sufferings and be able to understand who Jesus was and be able to discern his voice, we need to imitate him. We want to imitate what it is that Jesus did while here on earth. And this is a really fun verse. This is Acts chapter 4, verse 13. "When they saw the courage of Peter and John and realized that they were unschooled, ordinary men, they were astonished. And they took note that these men had been with Jesus." That is so cool. I would like so much for someone to say, "Wow, I can tell that you have been reading the Bible and praying and fellowshipping with the Lord." And in fact, let me tell you a fun story. So I was in Big Rapids, and my car's headlight had an electrical issue, and I took it to the mechanic there. And I was sitting in a waiting room. I was talking to this lady and just being friendly with her. And she said to me, "Are you a Christian?" I was like, "Yes." And then she's like, "Is your dad a pastor?" I was like, "Wow, yeah, you're batting 1,000." She's like, I was like, "What made you guess?" I didn't, I wasn't doing anything particularly Christian-y, let alone PK-y. So she said, "Well, you just seem to be joyful and friendly, and you seem to have something that I see from Christians." She herself was not a Christian. I talked with her about that. She's like, "But I know that Christians are like you." And I thought that was so awesome. I was like, "Yeah, cool." So and this reminds me of that. It's like these people are like, "Oh man, these disciples, they were with Jesus. How did they get this learning? How did they get this boldness to be able to preach the gospel in the face of persecution?" And then they remembered, "Oh, these men were with Jesus." Are we following the shepherd to the point at which that people are like, "That is a follower of Jesus"? Are we imitating God so much that they're like, "Oh, he's been with Jesus. He's just like him"? That would be a cool thing. I told the lady, that is such a compliment. Thank you so much. Yeah. So, are we going to follow Jesus? Well, what are some examples of not following him? So, an example of not following Jesus would be, for instance, following the world. Following your heart, ambitions, desires. I'll get to the rest, but let's think about that. So, we talked about listen to your heart. No, we're going to lead our heart. We're going to follow the world. No, we're not going to follow the world. We're going to follow Jesus. We have ambitions and desires. Are you willing to submit those ambitions and desires to the will of the Father? I'm thinking of Jesus, who was at the Garden of Gethsemane, and he was facing what would be ultimately crucifixion. And he was in prayer there, and he knew that the will of the Father was for him to lay down his life in sacrifice. And yet, what he did was, he said, "Not my will, but yours be done." Now, if our goal in life is to say, "I want a big house on a hill, and I want to, be able to, sit in my rocking chair, retired on a porch and pick my banjo," then that's a great dream. But if God says, "Guess what? That's not my plan for you," then are you willing to set that aside and do something else that God would call you to do instead? And would you be willing to say, "I'm going to follow you wherever you take me, not my will, but yours be done"? So don't follow your ambitions or desires, but instead set them apart and submit them to the will of the Father. Follow other Christians. That is a very tempting thing to do. Instead of following Christ, to follow the sheep in front of you. Now, hopefully those sheep are following the shepherd. And so if you're following a sheep that's following the shepherd, it may look for a while like you're following the shepherd too. Do you follow that? Good. Okay. Perfect. So what's happening here is that for a while you will be in the flock of Christians that are following the Good Shepherd, but here's the problem that can happen if you're just following a sheep that's in front of you instead of the shepherd, is that sometime something might happen where some of the sheep go a different direction. And you have to be willing to say, oh, some of my sheep friends are going this way, but the shepherd is going that way. And if your sight is tunnel focused on the sheep in front of you, you will be led astray. And this happens where leaders in the church will fall away from the Lord. And this happens where Christians that are put up on a pedestal as leaders fall into sin, fall away from the Lord, and it's a discouragement to many others, and they draw many away with them. And it's because, in part, those sheep were not fully following the shepherd, but they were also just going along with the ride and following the sheep right in front of them. So that is an example of not following Christ. Another one would be to follow a false image of who Jesus is. So a temptation is to follow the Jesus that we have constructed in our minds, that we are comfortable with. In so doing, we are molding Jesus into our image. He begins to look a lot like us because that is who we are most comfortable with. And the danger now is that when we gather in our church buildings to sing and lift our hands in worship, we may not actually be worshiping the Jesus of the Bible. Instead, we may be worshiping ourselves. Yeah. I was reminded of two words yesterday, exegesis and eisegesis. So the one means that we are deriving truth from Scripture, and the other means that we take our preconceived pleasantries and our own desires for what the Bible should say, and we put that into the Bible, and then we read it, and then we're like, oh look, it confirms what I always believed. That is the wrong way to do it. So here's the idea with knowing who Jesus is we can either say, Jesus is who he claimed to be, and I'm going to follow his direction. Or we're going to say, well, the Jesus that I like to think about is like this, and I'm going to follow this Jesus. So are we willing to follow the real Jesus is the question. Are you following a made-up, constructed version of Jesus that you're comfortable with? Or are you following the Jesus who is the real one? Does that make sense? I hope it does. Yeah. So don't follow the fake Jesus. Don't follow the sheep in front of you. Please don't follow the world or your heart, your ambitions, or your desires. So let's talk about the cost of following Jesus. Are you willing to leave your nets like the disciples did? Are we willing to set aside our family? It says that they left their father. In Matthew it says, if anyone wishes to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. So Jesus is saying, if you want to follow me, sure, but you're going to have to deny yourself. You're going to have to take up your cross, which is a figure of speech, to say, join me in persecution and suffering, and follow me. Are we willing to do that? So this brings us to the crucial question for every professing and potential follower of Jesus. Do we really believe he is worth abandoning everything for? Do you and I really believe that Jesus is so good and so satisfying and so rewarding that we will leave all we have and all we own and all we are in order to find our fullness in him? Do you and I believe him enough to obey him and follow him wherever he leads? So you have to count the cost. You have to say to yourself, is it worth it? Because there's a half-built building here, you can see. And it looks kind of dumb. It looks like it's just sitting there useless and kind of pathetic looking. And that is a picture of what someone looks like that says, yeah, I'll follow Jesus, and then gives up. When he's like, oh, I didn't realize it'd be hard. I didn't realize I'd have to do things that I didn't feel comfortable with. And then they stop. And this is what it looks like. So in Luke it says, for if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying this person began to build and wasn't able to finish. So that's why you have to count the cost. You have to say, is it worth it? Up front, I'm going to make a decision that for better or for worse, I'm going to follow Jesus no matter what. Because otherwise, our life will look just like that. And it will actually be a stumbling block and a bad example to other people. Because they will look at this and they'll say, that's what Christians are. They look like that. They pretend to be like Christians, but they're hypocritical because then they fall away, and then they look at this and they say, that doesn't look appealing to me. Another example, and a similar story, is one of someone going to war, and he counts his men. He says, do I have what it takes to win? And he sits down and he counts the men and he says, can I make it? So similarly, we are offered the choice, right? There's that calling. The shepherd is saying, follow me. And he says, but there's a cost, there's a price. Are you willing to pay it? Are you willing to endure the hardship of suffering and follow me wherever I take you? Are you going to sit down and are you going to say, yes, it is worth it? And I'm going to persevere to the end. I'm going to run the race and I'm going to keep the faith the whole way through, and I'm going to make it all the way to the end. That is the goal. So don't look like that building right there. So life decisions. Sometimes you're going to come to a point in life where you have to make a decision. And when you have to make that decision, you're going to have to say to yourself, well, what am I going to do with my life? Am I going to follow my own desires, the calling of the world, the stranger telling me that the life of the party and all this is the way to do it? Or am I going to follow the shepherd who's promising me suffering and persecution and submission to the will of the Father? And when you make that decision, you're going to have to weigh it. You're going to have to count the cost. Jesus says, truly I tell you, no one has left home or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or fields for me and for the gospel will fail to receive 100 times as much in this present age. Homes, brothers, sisters, mothers, children, fields, along with persecutions, and in the age to come, eternal life. So he says, yep, if you gave those things up, you will be given 100-fold in return. And that's better than any investment here on earth currently. So, good, 100-fold. That is what Jesus promises us. And notice how he doesn't skip the persecutions part. He says, yeah, there will be persecutions. But then he says, and ultimately you will have eternal life. That's something we can look forward to. It says, if the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. Sometimes you'll make a decision and people will scoff at you. They'll be like, you know what, that's dumb, you're stupid, right? And the idea is, Jesus is saying, if you follow me, people are going to laugh at you. People are going to scorn you. But remember that happened to me first, right? If we're following the shepherd has gone on ahead of us and has experienced those same exact things. He's saying, if you're going to follow the lifestyle that I've done, just know that whatever you're going through, that happened to me too. For what it's worth, ultimately the cost of not following Christ is to be mistreated by the robbers that only come to steal, kill, and destroy. So sometimes we say, oh, it's not worth it. I'm not going to follow Christ. That's too hard. Remember, though, that you can only go one of two ways. You can go with Jesus, the shepherd, or you can go with the guy in the rusty van who's going to take you down a road that ultimately is not going to be good. So that's the ultimate choice. Peter says to Jesus, Lord, we've left everything for you. What do we get? And Jesus says, yes, you will get 100-fold in return. The choice of deciding to follow Jesus really is worth it. And that's something even Peter questioned. He was like, God, we've given everything. It's amazing. So there's a difficult path and an easy path. And the easy path looks wider and less steep, and there's a cliff at the end. So it looks, if you're short-sighted and you just look at your feet in front of you, you're going to tell yourself, well, this path looks easier, but it's not in the end. And when we make our life decisions, and I want to talk to especially younger people for a minute. There are a lot of really heavy decisions in life that forever change who we are and how we live our life. And the Lord has given us but one life to live. And then eternity is based on what we do with that. And our life is greatly shaped by a handful of decisions that are often made younger in life. And I'm thinking of where you're going to live, what career you're going to have, who you're going to marry. These are things that will forever change the rest of your life and are often made in your teens and 20s. So I would urge every single one of you that are in that age group to submit early to the will of the Father on this point and to follow Jesus and what he's directing you to do. I talk to so many people who tell me, I wish I could have it back. I wish I could do it over again. And, I was thinking of the phrase, big doors swing on little hinges. And those little hinges are those decisions that you make. And are those decisions going to be ones that you make in accordance with the will of the Father or not? And those decisions will come at a time where you will either have had to resolve long before then to submit it to the will of the Father or not. So, ahead of time, I think it's so important to sit down and say, yes, these decisions that I'm going to make are going to be done in a way where I am trying as best as I can to discern the difference between the voice of the shepherd or the voice of my own heart telling me what I would want to do, which I hope are the same if we're submitting that to the Father, but when they're not, to disregard it. And then the voice of the stranger. Sometimes Satan really will come and tempt you and say, let's go this way. And even if later you stop listening to the voice of Satan and start to try to follow the shepherd again, your life will be forever scarred by those decisions that were made during a time of life that were not in submission to following the Good Shepherd. And so, I guess one last time, urge young people especially to early in life make the decision to follow Christ and to submit the decision-making to the Father.
Amen.
Thank you. So what does following look like? I wanted to think of what that looks like. So I thought of two examples. Ruth followed Naomi and said, your God will be my God, and I will go your everything will be my everything. I don't remember the words exactly. So I put it up on the clip. Okay. So but Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you from me. That is an example of following someone. Am I right? I would hope so. Yes. Here's an example of not following. And I think of Jonah. Now, Jesus said, go this way. And from what we understand, both geographically speaking and spiritually speaking, Jonah went in the exact opposite direction. And that is an example of not following the Lord. So, what should it look like to follow? So Jesus set an example for us in how he lived his life here on earth. And oftentimes while he lived that life, he would say things before he did it. And he'd say, yeah, I'm doing this so that you know that that's what you're supposed to do. So he'd say, do this in remembrance of me, right? Or he goes and he's baptized. John the Baptist says, Lord, you should be baptizing me, not the other way around. And Jesus says, no, I'm doing this to set an example so that people will follow this. So Jesus led his life in this way. And I just thought of just a couple examples of what it is that Jesus did. He washed his disciples' feet. He showed an act of servitude to others. And then he said, go do this amongst yourselves. So in my family, on Monday, Thursday, which is a couple days before, the day before Good Friday, we do this because this is something that Jesus asked us to do. He said, I set an example, follow it, right? Yeah, I serve others. Are you willing to do the same? He also was an evangelist. He went to the woman at the well, and he talked to her, and he told her that what she needed was living water, right? And told her the gospel message. That's an example that we need to follow. We need to be able to come alongside people, strangers even, and say, the life you're living is sinful, right? And that's the voice of conviction that people want to run away from. But what we have to say is we say, you have a life that is destined for destruction. And you are living a life of sin, and here's the antidote for it. And so we can do what Jesus did with the woman at the well, with our friends and people that we come into on our travels, and anything else. So this is another example of what Jesus has done that we need to follow. And then here we have Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And I think I mentioned this before, where Jesus submits his own desires to the will of the Father. And he says, not my will, but yours. That's also found in the Lord's Prayer, when he teaches his disciples to pray. He says, Lord, not my will, but yours be done. And this is what we see of Jesus here. He's looking in the face of what he knows is going to be death and crucifixion. And he says, I'm willing to do it. And that's the kind of Jesus that we follow. That's the kind of Jesus that does things that we need to be willing to do. And of course, here, Jesus in baptism. This is something that I believe that is something that Jesus did as an example for us to follow. I'm thinking of a verse in James that says, submit yourselves then to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Come near to God, and he will come near to you. Wash your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. If you submit to God, then the devil will flee from you. So the devil is that stranger, and he's got plans for you that are not good. But if we do submit to the will of the Lord, then we are promised that Satan will flee from us. End of the slideshow. Let me say a few other things, though, that didn't make it on the slides. I think that, for me personally, I have been greatly benefited from, at different points in my life, praying both alone and with my Father about decisions in my life. And I'm thankful for that. And time and again, I see that ultimately what the plan of Jesus was is far better than what I would have thought in many cases. And I'm grateful that I had the willingness to follow what Jesus had for me in those decisions. And I've talked to so many people that say, you know what? At first, I was anxious and worried that if I submitted my life to God, that I would be miserable. But that's a misunderstanding of who Jesus is. It's a misunderstanding of the promise that Jesus has for us. If we look at Jesus and we know that Jesus loves us, then we have every reason to trust him. I think of parents and their children, that relationship, where the child is being asked to obey the parents. And if the child has any kind of thought that the parents don't have their best interests in mind, then there's a conflict where the child thinks, this parent is trying to control me, or this parent really doesn't love me. There will not be a desire to submit. There will not be a desire to follow or obey. But when that child knows that the parent has good things for him and that they love their children, I think of the example of how, Jesus says, even earthly parents give good things to their children. Even earthly parents, if a child asks for a loaf of bread, you're not going to give them a rock. No, you're going to give them what they need. And this is the relationship of God in relationship to his children. And so I think that a mistrust in God and an unwillingness to submit our decisions to the will of the Father is based in a misunderstanding of who Jesus is and what he has planned for us and how much he loves us. Jesus loves us more than we could ever know. And if we can just keep in mind that Jesus died for us out of love, then that really clears it all up, at least for me. The knowledge that Jesus loved me so much that he died for me gives me all of the confidence that I need to know that if I submit my life to him, that the plans that he has for me will be far better than the plans that I could make on my own without the direction of prayer. There's one last thing that I want to do before I close. There's a song that I wanted to sing with you all. And I'm not the established worship leader, so I hope I'm not taking advantage of this, but I would like it if we could all sing, I have decided to follow Jesus. And the thing that it says is, I have decided to follow Jesus. And I hope that when you're singing that song, that's because you mean it, that you really have decided to submit your decisions to Jesus. And then it says, the world behind me, the cross before me. That reminds me that the world and the flesh, those things we put behind us. And the cross and those sufferings that we are willing to suffer and partake in the persecution that Jesus himself did as a result of following him, that we are willing to go that direction. And so we're saying, that the world is behind me, and this cross and the suffering and obedience to Jesus Christ is before me. That's the second verse. And then the third verse is, now, will you decide to follow Jesus? And I can take that either of two ways. Either that means that, I'm telling you to do, will you follow Jesus? But I almost think of it this way, which would be even cooler, is as if we are then going to other people in evangelism and saying, will you decide now to follow Jesus? And this kind of reminds me of the Great Commission, that we are ordered to go and tell people and tell them that they need to follow Jesus. And then finally, I would like to come back around to the first verse again and say, I have decided to follow Jesus. So here we go. I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back, no turning back. The world behind me, the cross before me. The world behind me, the cross before me. The world behind me, the cross before me. No turning back, no turning back. Will you decide now? Will you decide now to follow Jesus? Will you decide now to follow Jesus? Will you decide now to follow Jesus? No turning back, no turning back. I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided